when you're creating roughness maps, it's usually one of the primary maps that really sells the character when it's come to shading. Um, some people usually like to start with that map, so no texturing, no albedo, maybe some roughness and standard height information. So getting started, the first thing you want to do in Substance Painter is basically set it up in a way where it's conducive for creating cool and nice roughness textures. One of the first things I do is if you come into the display properties, we've got environment map HDRs, and this is going to give all the lighting information. Trying to look for something that's fairly flat. I like using the Studio 3 because it gives some nice indications of what a really tight highlight's going to be. So when it comes into game and those really tight lights and bright lights are going to come, you know what the maximum is going to be, and then you can start to tone it down. So my preference is Studio 3, and then later on we can switch that out for something a bit softer, or use an HDR with some colors, which is where the roughness really comes into to sell itself. So starting at Studio 3, this just shows a basic baseline for what Substance starts with in terms of base color and roughness. Um, Ideally, what you want to do is create a new fill layer. And so this fill layer is going to be the primary base. And if you hit Alt and click on the color, that just means that the color is going to be selected. Going to turn that to a pure black, so 000. And this really brings forth what the highlights are going to look like. This is a black character. So usually the roughness is more important in these terms because you can really see the contrast. White characters, not so much, but still, as far as shaders go, you really want to focus on roughness maps. Um, so we've set up our substance in a way we can work with it. Before we start painting anything, I definitely suggest looking at references. So I like to use Pure Ref. I'm basically looking for um, normal unmake-upped versions of the character that we're trying to replicate. So something along these lines won't be very clear. They're using makeup to pretty much hide those highlights. That's what it's made for. Um, Images like this, really high fidelity, where you can zoom in and see where certain parts of the face have different specular highlights and roughness values. Also, when it comes to if a character's sweating, like where the drips start to build up, where they follow the face. Don't go crazy. Don't use massive extremes like these ones. And also, when it comes to blurry textures, you can't really translate that back onto your model. So high quality textures, no makeup, and basically a lighting that's similar to your substance scenario. Some of these might be overblown or overdrawn, so that's something to bear in mind. Starting out, I try and find a base value for the roughness. So we're going to keep on adding layers. I'll just call this the base color, inverted caps. I'm first going to make a folder and just call it roughness. That means I know that if all the roughness values are going to be inside of here. If you create the first fill layer, this is going to act as the roughness base. You want to isolate roughness. So again, Alt clicking the roughness and basically use this slider to find a value which is going to act almost like a midpoint. So we're going to create additional layers that are going to dictate like dryness and grease. So a value like this is fine. You can always come back and change it later. Always use shift and right click just to move the lighting around, because roughness is one of the more dynamic texture sets. So you do really want to glisten the light across there and see how it works. Because the studio has 4 sets of lights, you'll see how it interacts with the character. Also to note, depending on the actual normal maps and height maps of your character, if the physical sculpt itself has a lot of cavities and lots of maps, then obviously the character is going to be more rough in surface. So when the light does go across it, it will look less smooth. So these values aren't going to be pure PBR values. They're going to be based on the character you had yourself. So if this didn't have normal maps, then potentially you might be looking at a lower roughness value or a higher roughness value. In the case of this asset and how the normals come across, I'm looking at something like that. So If at any time you want to see the roughness on its own, you can change the material set to a texture and click roughness. So that's obviously our flat base preview. And then if you press M, that comes back to it. So the next layer I want to focus on is sort of like a wet or grease layer. I'm just going to call it that so I can reference it later. Again, Alt click the roughness. It's covering the entire asset. So this is going to be considered the near maximum grease that this character is going to have. So we've already denoted like what a medium dry character is going to be. And then this is going to be the wet value. It's nice to keep it in layers because you can come back to it. It's a non-destructive workflow. We can change these at any time. What I'm going to do now is, now that wetness layer has been set up, is right click and add a black mask. And so that's going to get rid or hide all of the wet parts. And basically with a certain brush selected, I usually like to use one called sponge. It's really good for characters. We're going to select the mask itself and have the brush set on a white value. And then we can basically bring back that wetness and start to draw it in. You'll probably see that it's a bit harsh. We can either tone it down in the layer itself, or in this case, the flow of the brush itself is quite high. So you can drag that down. It's going to have a lighter effect. From here on, it's about looking at your references and painting sweated areas where you can see it on your reference. As a general rule, you'll usually find that the forehead's quite sweaty. We call it the T zone. So the top of the T being the forehead and the lower T being the nose. So you just want to lightly paint until it looks right, and then continuously moving the light just to see how it plays. Maybe the lips and the eyes are going to be slightly more wet, more natural, moist areas that have a lot of blood flow seem to have a lot of wetness on them. So you can spend as long as you want trying to get those as accurate as possible. If at any time you want to see where you've been painting this, you can alt click the mask itself. And that's going to basically preview where parts of the wetness are being shown and are being hidden. If you want to remove some parts of it, you can just press X, and then that's going to invert the color of the brush. So in this case, it's going to turn it to black, and then you can paint back the areas. So it's just going to show our base roughness scale. So you usually spend a little bit of time on that, trying to get it really perfect. But in this case, I'm just going to fly through it. The next thing I like to do is add sort of like an area where roughness isn't happening, so inside the pores, because there's not going to be any water build up there, and it gives it quite a nice high detailed look. So if you go to roughness, what I'm going to do is something slightly different. Is not actually painting a mask in there, but using the baked information, in this case a cavity map, to denote where the like cavities and pits of the pores are, and then we're going to turn that into a roughness value that's quite high, so it doesn't shine as much. So I'm just going to set it just now as a preview so I can see it. We're going to call this a pore layer. You can right click and change the color of that. The pore layers existence in this stack is important, so I do like to move it around. If it's red, I can see where it is and scale it up and down. So with that pore layer, I'm just going to add a black mask, so introducing a mask. This time what we're going to do is right click and add a fill layer. So instead of a paint, it's going to be referencing a texture. The texture in this case is actually going to be from our project files, a curvature map. So the curvature map is from when you bake out your high poly to low poly stuff. If you haven't made a high poly, then you won't have this feature. You'll have to sort of try and replicate it in other ways. But you can take that curvature map and drag it into this fill layer. So what's happening here? This fill layer is now considered our mask. So wherever an effect is going to happen, it's going to be based on this texture mask. Good way to see that is if we reactivate color and then potentially turn it to red, you can see where it's having its effect. At this point, it's not really covering the pores that much. So if I go back into the mask, and on top of this fill layer, we're going to add a levels. So levels is going to be a modifier, and because it's on top of this stack, basically any levels that we change here is going to affect what's below here. Very quickly, levels, we're basically changing how the grayscale is transitioning across the entire texture. There's plenty of resources out there to look at it. Basically, if you move these sliders, you can see what sort of interaction it has with that previous texture. I'm going to move these about until I find something that really brings out the pores and any wrinkles. I don't want to go overboard. Any issues around here, we're going to paint out afterwards. So I like that. I think that looks good. Going to take off the color, and you can see the effect. It's very minor. It might not come across so well in the video, but we can see the effect is bring out all the work we put into the high poly sculpt, and making it basically look a bit more realistic. So one issue is that these are causing a bit of a problem. So on top of this layer, we can add something called paint layer. So right click and then adding a paint layer. Think of this as almost like a artifact repair layer. So we can come into here, and then with a certain brush selected, we can press X, turn that to black. And then we're just going to paint on top and paint out the areas that we don't want the effect to happen. So this is mainly going to be on the eyes. If at any time you want to activate symmetry, you're going to be clicking this button as well. So you can paint out any areas that you don't want to be affected. The nice thing about this is a non-destructive workflow. So at any time you can hide and show it, bring it back, maybe delete it and start again. But basically getting rid of areas that are poking out and aren't considered cavities. So that's just the nature of baking systems. It's going to try and find edges and stuff. So you just have to repair it afterwards. So we spent some time on that. The next layer I'd probably focus on is a dryness layer. So there are dry parts of the face, usually underneath the eyebrows, inside the nose, parts of the ear. The ear doesn't tend to sweat too much. And then obviously depending on the stubble or any facial hair, we'd start to put dryness in there. I'd Control C and Control V the wet layer, and then I'd bring that on top of the pore layer. This time just rename it dry. The reason I copied it is it just means I don't have to fiddle around with changing the roughness selections. I'm going to put the roughness high to indicate it's going to be a rough layer, and then turn the mask black. So this time it's not actually affecting anything. At this point, I'm going to paint out the dry areas. So focusing potentially on the top, maybe the eyebrows, inside the nose, things like ear holes, and basically anywhere you want to tone it down ever so slightly. You can come back to the layer and obviously see its effects. So it's removing that highlight. And then the best way to view that is just scrolling the light on top of it. So I'd consider this a good baseline. You'd obviously want to smooth out any really rough transitions. The pore layers, bringing that detail back. The next thing I'd want to do is add more unique elements to that. And it's making use of stencils, which can be really good for making roughness maps or any sort of albedo. So if you come and we're going to make another roughness map, so just isolating that, going to use this as almost like a sweat dripping. So what we saw with the reference, basically something similar to this, where the highlights are quite thin in comparison to the other pieces. You could manually draw in some drips, but the best thing to do is take advantage of what Substance has to offer. So they got some procedural maps. Seem to have lost the shell, so I'll have to reset the cool. So properties, I actually just like to drag it over here because it's nice to use. Setting that to quite a shiny value, and then again, same process, adding a black mask. This time, what we want to focus on is something called procedurals, or maybe even grunge maps. So cut that out, trying to save some time looking for a nice grunge map. Does matter. So a grunge leak large I'm going to use. I'm going to use that in combination with the projection. So with the projection activated, and if you scroll down in properties, there's going to be a section here called grayscale. going to drag that grunge leak onto here. It's basically going to chuck it into the viewport. From here, what's going to happen is every time you draw with the brush, it's almost going to stencil it back onto the character. I'm going to turn off symmetry. So an example of that is when we draw it, you can see the effect it's having. It's basically pasting that texture that we had back onto here. The only problem is it is quite a smooth asset, so it's giving that like really clean look. If I come back into projections, what I can do to negate that is change the contrast and the balance. So we really want something that's just on or off and bringing out the major drips. Um, so find something that is obtaining the information that you want. I think something like that would look good. If at any time you want to move the stencil, so like change its rotation to match the character, if you hold S, you can click and drag to rotate it. You can also scale it with the normal Maya functions. Right here, what I'm going to do is try and find areas where I can draw this drip on. So I'm just going to select things like that. You can see how it transfers on. Basically do this across the character, depending on how sweaty it is. You can use different procedurals and put them into the grayscale, just so they have different effects. So in this way, you can change the balance and then find what really works for you. If at any time things are looking weird, it can accidentally go into the almost metallic realm. You can either change the roughness scale so it fits nicely, or you can come back into the mask and just rub it out, so get rid of it. So it's a really iterative workflow. What you're looking for is the major features, maybe drips that are going to come out at certain points when the character is looking at light sources. You can get really fancy with that, so you could make use of substance, procedurals, and particles. So if I'm creating another layer here, it's going to probably our final roughness layer. Isolate that roughness layer, give it quite a wet look. Add a black mask. This time I'm going to make use of particles. So particles are generated in substance, and they're basically going to draw on the mesh depending on what the 3D asset is. So that's going to involve things like the best ways to show it. So if we go to leaks and we start to paint, it's going to throw some particles out here. And what's to note is just make sure we are on a brush and it has white selected. So coming to leaks, you can start to throw some particles on here, and then those particles are basically going to draw on your alpha. So different ones here. Maybe you had like a crying character, don't know why, but you can do those effect, and it's going to adhere to the contours of the mesh. So let's see what that looks like. Come back to here. I just double check. I think accidentally a layer was made instead of fill. So on the mask, use the particle effects. Got this crying person, and then come back into the major properties. You can start to change this. So that's how you start to build up the roughness of a character. We can start to experiment with a bit of height information that does affect the roughness. If at any time you want to fine tune this, you can come back to the previous layers that we made, change the roughness values. But the major point to focus on is at least we've got these different segments that are isolated, and then we can come back and fine tune it to match the references. So maybe someone who's a little bit more sweaty or has a greater roughness value for their base layer. A very quick tip when it comes to putting additional information in there. So this time off roughness, we're going to be working with height, but it does affect how the light goes across the asset. So add a fill layer. This time going to use height in isolation, and then adding a black mask. What I want to do here is basically paint some spots. So I'm going to look for a spot brush. There might be some cool one. Spot spray. Let's try that. The main focus is drawing some spots. These might be a little bit too fine, but we'll see how it works. Maybe some large ones like that. Let's rub out this. Once that mask is selected, so where the spots are going to be indicated, you can increase the roughness, and you can see that it's actually putting some information into the normal map. Now, because those spots are coming out, while it's not physically changing the roughness texture itself, it is changing the surface information of that model. So when light does go across it, it's interacting in a different way. So you can introduce things like potentially pores into the height, so something like that. And now you can see it looks a bit more rough because it is physically rougher, not just in the roughness texture map. So those are the things to bear in mind. Um, After that, and you've set up your lovely roughness map, usually what you'll find is that the albedo color doesn't matter too much. Most of it's brought out in the roughness itself. So while just using a basic fill, this can look like a pretty realistic character. So for a black character, maybe changing some values here. The only thing we're working with is a base color like that and a roughness color like this. So imagine putting all the details in here and then spending sort of a small amount of time making some base color. And then all in combination will look like a really realistic character.